Welcome to Hort Culture, where a group of extension professionals and plant people talk about the business, production, and joy of planting seeds and helping them grow. Join us as we explore the culture of horticulture. I'm here. I'm excited. I'm ready to roll. How are you guys? Yeah.
Fine
Same.
and dandy.
Brett's got
Same.
like a sweet shawl going on right now. I'm
He does.
loving
A
it.
three-quarter
it's
zip or a quarter
Stephen,
zip?
It's a Stephen West pattern. It was knitted by Dr. Annie Kemple.
You have an inside track on those products, I hear.
Well,
From
sort
the
of.
Kimball collection.
Sort of like the ratio of things of sweaters she knits for her to things she knits for me is like 30-1. So
I mean, she's
back to
doing
me
the
in
work.
20
So
get back to me in 2026 for my next addition to the fall collection.
Accessory. But they're quality accessories, though, Brett. I can tell that.
No, it's very nice.
Yeah.
I'm just razzing. It's pretty cool. I think of it. The colors make me think of like it's like a lion's mane or something. You know, like rawr,
Lion King.
that kind of thing.
Oh, I thought that you needed like a wide brim hat on and a pumpkin spice latte. That's where I was going.
What?
In the best way. I mean, in the best way.
You do
That
need
would be-
coffee
that would make-
accessory with that. You do need
that would-
like a coffee, a specialized coffee drink with that, I feel. Yeah.
That
I
would
get
make
that.
me. I could have my yerba mate cup.
And the Andes Mountains, like you're leading a mule up a single track path.
It's
Yeah,
with like a
that's it.
big sun hat makes me think of like, what's his face from Island of Dr. Moreau? Like
Yes.
I don't know, just somebody really eccentric.
Yes.
Yeah.
That
For
lives
some
there.
reason, it makes me think of Johnny Depp, especially with like
Yes.
the crazy like tired bags under my eyes, and I look like Johnny Depp. Like
Just kind of like you got to move in a
Little bit of
weird way.
Jack Sparrow in
Yeah.
there.
A little bit,
Yeah.
little bit of Jack. Yeah.
like Keith
Yeah.
Richards, kind of. Yeah.
I can tell it's winter. We're all in. It seems like we're all morphing slowly into winter mode, and I don't know exactly what that is. But for me, it's short day mode. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Slowly,
it's
slowly. I
gloomy
found
as
myself.
heck outside.
Yeah, and I found
Mhm.
myself yesterday already checking like the date for like winter solstice. I'm like, when is
The
Yeah.
sun returning?
when are we going to start going the other
Well,
direction?
It's
Yeah.
funny that you say solstice because that is when I start thinking about transplants for the following year. Actually, is when the light
Yes.
starts to return.
We never think about
I've been
transplants soon
thinking
enough.
about it.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm
Mhm.
always
Never stop.
thinking about it, but yeah.
Never
Well,
stop.
Can't stop,
I'm
won't
thinking
stop.
I'm thinking about even more than always, whatever that is.
I'm thinking about it
Mhm.
even when I'm not thinking
Always
about
and
it.
forever.
I'm thinking about
I-
1,000 times, always times a million.
So that's what we're talking
I
about today,
never-
y'all. Josh, are you even a plant person? Like, I mean,
I never
That a
stop,
person.
never stopping.
that tracks. But anyways, we're talking about
Josh just goes out in
transplants today.
December, throws a handful of seeds into the field, and lets God decide.
Mhm.
Yes, let
Yeah,
him sort them out.
Transplants.
Yeah. It's
What
the
are
virtue of inaction or appropriate
Right.
action. You people
Right.
are
It's
all like
Darwin.
working against nature. I'm with nature.
No, I mean, I'm
Nature
waiting
doing
for the light to
Nature's
return.
vicious.
I'm waiting for the light to return. Not
You know, and you said you're working with nature, and that's real funny because some of the best it always kind of gets under my skin a little bit as I spend all this money on, in the past I've spent money and resources on like grow tables and with heat
Mhm.
mats, 80-degree heat mats, and a light source, all the money for growing transplants, and the dumb tomato seeds that fell out from last year produce these beautiful transplants that are ahead of mine the next year because Mother Nature apparently
Direct
knows what
seeding,
she's
bro.
doing. I mean, I
Right.
don't get it. I mean, has anybody else had those experiences? The best I go out and dig them up and then plant them, and then I'm like looking
Yeah.
at all my accessories that I've purchased. Like, what good are you?
It's
So,
volunteers, volunteers like
Only the
they're
strong
on
survive.
program.
yeah, it's on that natural kind of. It goes through nature's cycle of cold and the seasonal changes and all of this. But yeah, it's always amazing that some of the best plants I've ever grown have been on the edges of compost piles that
So-
have taken care of themselves.
So, Alexis, maybe before we jump into some of the techniques or approaches, that timeline thing I think is helpful. So, when do you think of, or I guess, what are you starting at this point, and what do you think of as the window when you're going to start putting some seeds into soil and trays?
Well, I mean, it's 100% dependent on what you're growing and what season it's in. So, are you growing? We've talked about warm season versus cool season.
Mhm.
And a lot of those things, if they're fast or slow, and how many times, because like you could be seeding, and there are times if I'm on my game, which is rare, but every once in a while, I'm seeding on a much smaller scale, but through the summer, to have fall crops, but also to have a second round of summer crops, depending on what they are and how fast. But I mean, I think for most of us who are growing outside, you can start thinking about some of those early things in Kentucky, seeding them in probably March if you're going to do like cool season veggies or cool season flowers. You
Or
can
even
just,
March 10th is tomatoes and peppers. I mean, March 10th, March
no,
15th, that's tomatoes and peppers. That's
is
6 to
it?
8 weeks.
Oh,
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah, which is crazy to me. That always shocks me that it's
Mm-hmm.
that early, and that's the number one thing when I'm talking with people, that's just even saying that out loud now seems like it's wrong. I'm gonna go have to
See, I
check
push them. I
myself.
always think as tomatoes and peppers is closer to 4 to 6 weeks that time of year, and I think
Yeah.
that I think it's practice. And you're
Mhm.
going to be like, the biggest thing: read the back of the package, those days to maturity,
Yes.
how many weeks
Yeah.
before. We've talked about that before, so you can go back and check out that episode. But it's planning. So like I will spend December and January looking back at what I have done in the past. But if you've not done this before, collect everything you want to grow. You've probably already bought it. And if you haven't, you're about to buy it because you're about to get a buttload of seed catalogs in, and it's
Hmm.
very exciting. It's
All the
like,
seeds.
oh, it's like a kid at Christmas circling all the toys in the book. But, so you're going to get those in and you're going to look at them. And I hate to say it. No, I don't hate to say it. I love to say it. And Josh is going to love it. Have a spreadsheet.
Yes. Yes.
But
Yeah,
you can also,
transplanting's all about the data. Yeah, all about the numbers.
yeah. And
So
so,
I would just briefly like to point out I love spreadsheets and like on a deeply personal level. And so every
uh-huh.
time that
Mhm.
only Josh gets the spreadsheet love, I do feel a little left out. I just want to share my feelings,
You know,
working
I
and
through
think
it.
all of us
that
here
part of my
love
mind, I
spreadsheets
enjoy them a little bit, just a little bit too.
differently.
So
Like,
Well, Annie's friends make fun of me. Like I'll be like thinking about a thing, and she'll be like, "Oh, are you gonna make a spreadsheet for that?" I'm like, "No, that wouldn't make any sense because the spreadsheet wouldn't be the right tool for that."
that's not the right
you
format.
can
And
never,
the
I would
correct
never make
answer
fun of you for
is
that.
yes, I will be making a spreadsheet of
Yes.
that.
And you
Yeah, a
will be
spreadsheet of all
jealous.
the hurtful things you've said to me now.
But
Really
you
go
don't have
quantify
to
those
do a
comments.
spreadsheet. You can do a piece of notebook paper and make your
Sorry,
own
yeah.
little
So
columns.
some way of keeping the record and sketching out. And what are
Right.
you sketching out in this document?
So for me, one thing that I don't think people think about, but it will save you some time if you grow the same things every year, is if it's how you sow it. So what I mean by that is some seeds have to be in complete darkness in order to germinate. When I'm doing my research, I'm already looking in the places that tell me, how this should be sown. Does it need to be surface sowed where it's going to get light? Does it need complete darkness? Does it need high humidity? There's all these like little things. A lot of times the seed package will tell you. And so while I'm already looking up how many days it is, to germinate, and how many days until I can get it out in the field, I'll make a column for that, and that will save you a lot
Alexis, I
of
think
time.
people are tripped up on flowers, especially, and so am I. A lot of us are maybe have more experience. Some of us maybe with vegetable seedlings, but with
Mhm,
flowers, I get tripped up on that. Is that a common
mhm.
thing with different flower crops that some of those need to be subsurface, some of those need to be surface, or
Yeah,
the
yeah,
requirements are different? And sometimes I forget to look, and I end up doing the wrong process.
right, like, if you bury a snapdragon seed, it's probably not gonna come up because it needs light to germinate. That's just part of it, the way that plant drops its seed, and when it drops, that's the way the seed has, learned to do its thing. So, but I mean, there's stuff like that in the vegetable world. You don't want to plant seeds
Yeah.
too deep, so that's something that you can also write down. So a 1/4 inch deep, or something along those lines. So when how many weeks before frost, your seed package will say, hey, so put me in 6 to 8 weeks. I always tell people it's better to have transplants a little later. Like, it's better to get them in a week later or 2 weeks later
Yeah,
than you thought
always.
than have them be stuck in a tray for too long. Like, you
Mhm.
don't
Sure.
don't sow things too early. You will really do more damage. And it's hard. Like, it's so exciting to be able to start seeds and to see something grow. And I know it's hard, but like do yourself a favor and follow the rules for
So just to
Basically, two pieces of information there, Alexis, is what I heard in summarizing what you just said is you need two pieces of information. You need to know when typically that transplant, because we're talking about transplants today, not direct seeding into a garden, whatever you're,
hmm
putting in a garden. You need to know, number one, the average date that that transplant is supposed to go in the garden, and everything from that point. Once you know that piece of information, you can reverse engineer the
hmm
process. The next piece of information you need to know is how many weeks it takes to produce on average a finished transplant.
hmm
And if it's a pepper that takes 6 to 7 weeks, based on that given variety, and you know the date that it's supposed to go on the ground, you're just reverse engineering that back 6 weeks, and that's when it needs to go,
into a
being
right?
seeded. Yes. So that those two pieces of information, is that what I'm hearing? That's what we need to know for the date it goes in the ground and how many weeks to produce the transplant.
Yeah,
And
and then if
that's the
there's
beginning.
anything special about producing that plant, like darkness or light or something along those lines, that is.
Darkness, light, or humidity. Does that make you? I mean, just to kind of interject a question, like
Mhm.
you maybe group your trays according to those needs as far as like humidity and
Yeah,
temperature, and so that
I
way you have these different growing areas that you put them for your indoor spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly if you're germinating something that needs complete darkness to germinate, it will need light immediately, so you have to
Hmm.
check on it. So those are not as big of a deal, but the light when you're surface sowing, which is in a tray and you're just dropping the seed and you're not covering it with anything, I think the watering is what plays into that actually, because if you are watering from the top, you can displace those seeds. They go flying everywhere.
Yeah, right.
So everything that I need to water in a specific way, I'll group together, and then maybe
Hmm.
things that grow a lot faster and I know are going to need more water, they may need it twice a day. They'll get
Yeah.
grouped together in a different way. So yeah, and you might not know that getting started. You'll figure it out really quick. Like if you're attentive, just looking at your trays every day, you will kind of figure out the best way to do that. And that goes for, if you're doing transplants in what am I talking? Soil blocking or regular
Mhm.
plastic trays or the yogurt cup that you washed out. Like it doesn't, whatever you're growing it in, it's
Mhm.
applicable even if you are doing a huge greenhouse. This is how they do things. And I think
Yeah.
we talk about seeds a lot with transplants, but also something that I've started doing a lot more of, and that the light is really important for. We talk about like right, the light is
Hmm.
starting to come back, is growing from cuttings. So like scented geranium. I'm trying to think. You could do cuttings of tomatoes if you wanted. If you brought one tomato plant in that was in the pot and it's still alive and you want to keep it and have a bunch of little baby clones of that, you can do that. But geraniums are a good one. What else cuttings, Ray, do you usually see? I do chrysanthemums, scented geranium,
I'm trying to think what we do with master gardeners. We do the really easy things like
house
pothos and things.
plants, and
Yes,
yes,
house
like that.
plants,
Yeah,
jade. I
yeah.
mean, lots of the common things like that.
I've
One
done
other
I've done
thing.
elm,
Elm.
juniper,
Oh wow.
fruit
Okay.
trees,
Yeah,
not
woodies.
not so much fruit trees, but like ornamental trees,
Hmm hmm
all kinds
So
of cutting based stuff. Can I just
woody
really
is,
quick clarify? Can I
yeah.
clarify one thing that you
Yeah.
said earlier, or make sure I'm understanding? When you said earlier about you're excited, you want to get your seeds started and
Mhm.
do something in the middle of this cold time. So you're saying to me a 10-week transplant isn't necessarily better than a 6-week transplant if a 6-week transplant is the right time to be putting it outside, right? That's part of what you're saying.
So
That extra time, like let's say I have a plant and I've
mhm,
looked it up and the optimal transplant plant age is 6 weeks.
mhm.
If I'm growing that transplant, I want to put it in as close to that 6-week window
Hmm.
as
It's
possible.
very difficult for homeowners to hold transplants without them getting leggy. I mean, there's some things you can
Mhm.
do as far as manipulating water, but as far as like chemical treatments and inhibitors, we don't have a lot of the homeowners don't have a lot of those options, nor would they want that because
Well,
those are
And
applied in tiny
and
amounts. Yeah.
if you're not trying to hit a specific growing or planting window, like you're not trying to get it in as early as you possibly can, you're a little more of a flexible system.
It's
You're
better
better
to
off
start your seeds
to
later in the year.
wait and start your seeds
Yeah.
later,
Yeah.
let them
Mhm.
grow up, and then if you need an extra week past Derby Day in
Yeah.
Kentucky,
uh-huh.
then then put them out a little bit later because they're not ready. That's better. I just make sure that, because that was really nuanced and really
Yeah.
good
Yeah, yeah.
wisdom that you shared. I just want to make sure it didn't get
Thanks.
lost.
It's a terrible thing if you put those seeds in early and you end up having a cool spell late in the spring season, because, we know the average frost dates for where we are is like end of April, beginning of May, first week or two, give or
And it's an
take,
interesting
a few days.
the trade-off, because it's like, if you can get the plant into the ground, it's going to grow way faster in the ground than it is in a tray.
Mhm.
And so 2 weeks in the ground at the right time is way better than an extra 2 weeks in the tray because it's not ready to go outside.
Yeah,
And so
because
like
in the
that
tray,
whole,
you are really limiting like your fertility management. You're in a system that's very lean for as far as
Mm.
I think
fertilizer.
of it
You're in a
like
restricted
trying to keep a
little
kid
space.
in a shoe that's too small for them.
Goldfish, yeah.
So like their feet are gonna hurt. They're gonna be cranky when they walk around. There's all this kind of thing. And so then when they get into that bigger shoe, their foot is already achy. And so that they don't want to necessarily go out and run because their feet ache from that small shoe. So
you
like,
said your feet hurt and you're kind of cranky. Like, is that what it's like? Hitting your 30s also.
yeah,
The
yeah,
shoe
pretty much.
analogy is a good one. But you were
Yeah,
talking,
Pretty much.
leading
it's
us,
a
I
good
think, in
one.
the direction of cuttings, maybe, or talking about that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
cuttings. I just wanted to let people know it was kind of when we think about transplants. I think everybody knows this, but transplant is just essentially we've got a rooted plant that can go into the ground or a larger system, whatever that is. Maybe it's a large pot, maybe it's a raised bed, maybe it's a high tunnel, whatever that is. That's what we're talking about here. And I think that's obvious. But that plant that you're dropping into the soil can come from a cutting or it can come from a seed. Uh,
Mhm.
so I just wanted to be clear on that because cutting,
Yeah.
I think, is something a lot of time you'll start earlier because you've got to get it to root. It takes a while to root for a lot of these things. And we could do a whole episode on like how to take woody cuttings because the
I
time of
would
Mhm.
year.
love to do a series of episodes on propagation so I can learn
Yeah.
from you.
Oh, that's my
That'd be
my bread
cool.
and butter, man. Propagation, I
You put the
love.
pro in propagation.
We got that one fruit tree with 7 different apple
Yeah.
varieties. Yes, we do, because we like to experiment.
I'm
But
more of an amateur propagation person myself.
Mm.
You
Sorry.
like the island of Dr. Moreau is making more and more sense at this point, Josh. It really is. You like to create amalgams that is really akin to alchemy. Yeah, I like it.
Chimeras.
Yes,
yeah.
chimeras even. I'm trying to think as we're having this discussion here, and commercial producers have a pretty good handle on garden math and reverse engineering the process and putting together a good process to grow transplants. But I'm thinking of typical scenarios for homeowners and what they struggle with. It seems like light. You have to
Mm,
control like 4 or 5 major factors. When you to produce a good transplant, do a decent job as a homeowner. But when I'm working with people, it's always amazing to them that they always need more light than they think they do,
Mm.
because to produce a good transplant, you usually need, in most situations, yes, you can do a good job in windowsill, and I know folks that have south facing windows that can do a good job. Most people at home, I found, can't if they just want to grow a few transplants. It seems like they need supplemental light, and they're always shocked that they need to leave that. If it's a common recommendation I make to purchase a grow light and put that 2 to 4 inches once that transplant emerges, and you get it to germinate and starts growing, and you've got that light 2 to 4 inches on there. But not only the placement of the light 2 to 4 inches, but that thing needs to be on 12 to 14 hours a day. And that always
mhm.
surprises people. They're like, but the average growing day is like 8 hours. Well, that grow light is not the sun. It doesn't have
Right.
the same intensity. So you can either manage intensity or duration. In this case, you're just extending the duration of that grow light. So
Mm.
that's an important thing that I go over with people, that if you're going to go to the trouble and expense of purchasing a grow light, make sure that you understand that most common transplants, like garden transplants, I'm going to talk about, I have more experience in that area, but that you need to run that a certain amount of time, typically 12 to 14 hours. I start with that, but what
Yeah.
else? What other common tripping points do we have as
Well,
homeowners
and I
as they
think
start to
just
grow transplants? Yeah, go ahead.
on that light thing, the thing that you see that happens is the thing may germinate in response to warmth and moisture,
Yeah.
but then it'll be extremely weak, and or
Mhm.
it will grow what we call extremely leggy. It'll have really long
Yeah, it
internodes as
totally
the
is.
as the
Yeah.
plant stretches to try to reach the light. And that is not good for something like a tomato plant, for instance, because we
No.
want strong branching down low. We want it to be able to support that structure and then be able to flower. And it just creates a weaker transplant because it's basically the plant trying to survive in a non-optimal environment.
Reaches, yeah.
So I mean, in that regard, like that's why you want that
Yeah.
down close. So you're
Yeah,
bringing
and
the
it's a
light
weak
right
light
to the,
source. Yeah,
yeah.
Mhm.
exactly, Brett.
Yeah, it's like the plant is interpreting that there's some canopy cover and it's trying to go beyond it.
Yes.
Mhm.
It reaches to try to get that advantage. And, I manage all these things and I'm supposed to know what I'm doing. But we had a Master Gardener's class this past year, and I had a group of transplants that the Master Gardener seeded. I'm like, why are these things stretching? I've managed moisture, I've managed fertility, I've managed the light source, and I've
Mm.
managed, I thought, the nighttime temperatures because it was tomatoes. And come to find out in the meeting room, I was gone for a couple weeks and someone had cranked up the temperature and I didn't know it because I'd
Mm.
been turning the temperature down every night. Daytime temps were around 70 to 71. Nighttime, I was turning the thermostat down in the meeting room to 62 degrees or so. And someone found that uncomfortable apparently because it had ran for a couple weeks. The temperature had at about 75, 76 degrees. And it really caused all of those tomato plants to
Mm,
really stretch when I'd done everything else correct.
mm,
That the only variable that was different was the temperature, and it made a huge difference. And then finally it dawned on me. I was like, oh, the temperature got me. It wasn't fertility, which a lot of people think that the reason that plant stretches are getting too much fertilizer. I find that's not the case
Mhm.
most times for homeowners. In my case, that was just the temperature. I had the light that was perfect, a good light source, with the quality bulbs, but that was it. It was just a temperature thing. So homeowners, you're managing multiple things at one time. Temperature, the light, in some cases ventilation, and you're definitely managing moisture. But not only that, the temperature varies when you're trying to get these things germinated versus when they're germinating and they come through the ground. Then you have to kind of change things up a little bit. So
mm.
you're juggling. The thing that homeowners need to know is that you're juggling kind of multiple things at one time, making these considerations to grow a good transplant. Yeah,
Well, I think
lots of
you've
things
hinted
going
at
on.
another stumbling block, maybe, which maybe we could talk about temperature and ways of
Mhm.
dealing with that. I don't know if that's a good one to talk
Yeah,
about.
temperature is a good place for me to start because you oftentimes see these grow kits that you can purchase, and they have clear domes that go over those when you're trying
Mhm.
to germinate for a very good reason. Because it helps maintain moisture. And some seeds, I guess, Alexis, you guys, some seeds to actually germinate them take a higher temperature. A lot of garden crops is around 80 degrees, but there are certain garden crops that may take 90. You need to
Yeah.
know that by looking on the seed pack.
Mhm.
And the
Mhm.
humidity tent's going to help with that. It's going to help maintain moisture. But a stumbling block that I see there with temperature from the very beginning is not pulling that heat mat. If you're using a heat mat at home, not pulling that off quick enough. And that means looking at those seedlings every day. And once they germinate, usually I recommend in almost all cases immediately pulling that heat mat, turning that heat mat
Mhm.
off, because
Mhm.
that can cause real problems. And I've made that mistake before. Now, Josh, I know you're probably talking about later on if you don't manage or Brett rather, you're talking about later on managing the process, the temperature, and you have to do that too. You have to watch your day and night temps. It's not absolutely critical to turn the thermostat down at night, but that can help
Mhm.
because
And
temperature
like
for a lot of these crops is a little lower.
if you're new to the heat mat game, you can get ones that have a thermostat built in, but you
Mhm.
can also just get ones that are less expensive that
Yeah.
don't have a thermostat,
Set.
and you can buy a separate thermostat and potentially run multiple
Mhm.
heat mats off of one thermostat. And that's basically like the thermostat thing plugs into the outlet. It's got a little up and down arrow and other buttons maybe, and you set a temperature just like you do it on your your heat or your air conditioning or whatever, and
Mhm.
then you plug the heat mat into that, and it's got the thermostat has a probe that comes off of it. You can put the probe into the soil, because that's ultimately what we're caring about. We don't care about the making the whole room hot. We want that soil level
Right.
to be warm.
Yeah.
And you set it to, okay, when the soil temperature reaches 75 degrees, shut off the heat mat. When it drops below that, kick the heat mat back on. And those things are all very like widely commercially available.
Yeah, I've noticed the ones that you can find at local box stores are just, I believe they're the ones just set around 80 degrees because that's the most common temp.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But if you go online and look, you see these really cool kind of options like Brett's describing, the ones that you can actually control a little bit more. And if you're going to be growing a lot of transplants, I'd suggest maybe you look into those because you can get the mats and kind of modify those for the crops that are appropriate for 80 degrees, and then the ones that are more appropriate for 90 degrees. You can use the same mat for both different types of crops. If you're going to be growing a lot of transplants, kind of pay attention to that because germination temps do vary, and people that come and complain and say, "Oh, I've not had any luck growing such and such crop," it's usually those crops that take a higher germination temp.
Hmm.
That
Yeah.
in a lot of cases, that's it. So yeah, yeah,
Or the little
that
Yeah.
tiny,
happens.
tiny seeds that you can't
Oh, go
even
too
see.
deep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which media is? What do you guys think about media as far as growing transplants?
Oh
That's
man.
different. Also,
I think
that's a
we're
lot different.
saturated by it. I think it's too much all over Facebook. I think. Wait. Oh, sorry.
Saturation.
I see.
Oh,
I
we veered off.
Yeah,
We
I,
veered
I,
off.
I would like to hear what you all say about media because I think there's a lot of options, and there sometimes it's like surely the simplest, most straightforward option isn't the best, right? There's something I'm missing, right?
Well, with Alexis, what she said, she was getting ready to say something. I think that's what made me think about it when she said getting seeds too deep, and
mm.
that makes me immediately think about the type of media, first of all, that you're using.
Yeah, so I mean I like, and this is just what I like for seed growing and for starting well, even not all my cuttings go in this, but a majority of everything can go in a potting media that contains perlite, vermiculite, and it's a soilless media essentially. Perlite, vermiculite, and usually it's like a peat moss. For fine seeds, I prefer a peat moss, but if you're doing something larger, or you're doing cuttings of something, you could go with something more like a cocoa core, something a little bit more sustainable, if you'd like to, and fully support that. There are, I recently I had a friend up the street who said, Alexis, I'm having trouble getting these seeds started. I've reseeded. Can you watch them? Because I've got a better setup than she has. And I was like, yeah, sure. I mean, if you've done all the work seeding them, like I can water them when I water mine. And she brought them down and they were whatever soil media she had. And she bought it from just like, I don't
Some
even like,
store.
not even a box store, like a place that doesn't normally, they only sell potting media in the spring and you grab it with your groceries kind of store.
She bought it in a
And
yard sale.
yeah, basically.
eBay.
And I
Got on
think it was
eBay.
really old. I think, and
Hmm.
it had been open and it was really old, which does matter if it's not stored correctly. And her trays, the soil was so hydrophobic, I couldn't get it to hydrate. Like I
Yeah.
couldn't, and the soil was shedding the media size, individual particles in the media were so large for what she was growing, and I couldn't get it to hydrate. It's not even that I couldn't get it to stay hydrated. I couldn't get it to hydrate at all. Like I soaked the trays.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was, but it was like concrete. And I was like, well, Emily, this is why your plants are growing. And she's like, I know. And I'm actually going to go pick her up some soil when I pick up mine as well, of kind of the media that I prefer to use for most things. But you can also do, like, if you're doing something cuttings, they make these things called, that are like little, they're called oasis cubes. You've probably seen them, even transplants, and you've probably seen them in. They do start seeds in them, but they're like almost kind of like a foam that degrades, and it just is an easy way to stick cuttings in there, and much more simple. So that's kind of cool. But I prefer like a peat moss based media for seeds. Now for woodies or something like that, I think you can get away with a larger media, a barkier media, cocoa core kind of thing. So, or just straight perlite sometimes is the way to go.
I
So
found
when
for
you say,
beginners some. Oh, go ahead, Brad. Sorry.
I was just going to clarify. So when you say a peat moss based one,
Mm-hmm.
some of the things you might come across that are peat moss based mixes are things like a pro mix,
Mm-hmm.
something like the
Even
potting
Miracle
mix,
Grow, yeah, like
Miracle
a
Grow potting
Mhm.
mix, like they
Whatever
sell at a
brand.
big
Yeah.
box
yeah,
store.
yeah,
So that the brown kind of thready, it's
little
not, if you
dusty.
get it wet, it's not like mud, but it's like a little bit
Hmm.
spongy. That
Mm-hmm.
traditional
More
potting
spongy.
mix is
Yeah,
you're usually thinking of
yeah,
a peat based mix. And then
right.
when you say larger, the larger, you're typically mixing that yourself.
Um, there
or
is
you're buying in
one
that
that
source?
I have used that had a name. It was called Barky Beaver, and we used to use it at South Farm. You might probably remember the like big
Yeah.
stall
Yeah.
full of it, and that is really great. I think for woodies and certain like bumping up transplants because it's a little bit more. It just depends what you're growing. We didn't use that for too many things, but I've started a lot of cuttings before in perlite too, just straight perlite
Yeah.
in a very humid environment because perlite if you're not sure what I'm talking about, it's the white stuff that's in potting mix. And so I've grown full large cucumber plants in that before. So as long as it has nutrients and plenty of water, it can do a lot. But yeah, I mean, I think if you're just wanting to do seed, don't buy it from a store that doesn't regularly have it,
Mm.
is one recommendation, because a
Rotate.
lot of
Make sure they rotate stock and have fresh
yeah,
stuff.
if it's
Right.
old, it will clump up in a weird way, and sometimes
Don't
things.
purchase anything that says garden soil because
Yeah,
that's
don't
usually
put.
or
Yeah,
mineral based soil
yeah,
that and
that's
you can usually tell because that bag weighs 100. I mean, it's very, very heavy
yeah, it's
and
got
So
like
it should
it's
sand
say,
in it.
am I correct? It should say like potting
Potting,
mix.
yes,
potting
yes,
mix. And
yes.
if you're new to starting seeds, maybe even go one step further, not only potting mix, but look for seed starting mix, which tends to be way more fine. The
Hmm.
consistency is a lot different. And those mixes tend to be in smaller bags, the seed starting mixes, and they have some modifiers in there.
I see.
And a lot of times,
I don't. Maybe you have better experience with the seed starting mixer. And the ones I've always seen that are locally available here have starter fertilizer in them, and I don't
yeah,
recommend that.
yeah, I generally do not like that because that's another variable that takes it's out of my control. Then and I do not like that.
Well, and seeds they don't like fertilizer that quickly. I mean, they need
No,
fertilizer, within a kind of a week or so of popping up, but like that, those couple days when they're just germinating and that little baby radicals coming out, and our little cotyledons,
not
that
true
can be
leaves, which are later.
detrimental. Yeah.
I jumped on that. I
Not
didn't
you
want to
all
miss
as
true
true
leaves.
leaves.
Yeah.
But that can be detrimental, and it's a kind of a waste of money. You can get regular fertilizer, whether that's organic or conventional, a lot
Mhm.
cheaper than what you're paying for in that mix. So,
Usually, people that tend to get their seeds too deep, that's the ones that I'm like, why don't you try this really fine mix?
oh, that makes
Because
sense. Yeah.
if they're using the fine mix, if they're seeding tiny seeds, the seeds have a lot less chance to go too deep into the
Yeah.
mix. If it's a fine mix, and they're
Yeah.
they're the ones for homeowners specifically that I kind of start to recommend. I start to question them, and if they start mentioning a bunch of things that are tiny seeded, I'm like, consider a seed starting mix if you have tiny seeds. Not so important for peppers and tomatoes because you can use a general, from my experience, a mix for that, and it's harder to go too deep on those. You can go too deep, but
You know
it's
what
not as critical.
I recommend for people, instead of, especially if like they've already bought something, you kind of feel bad about like telling them to buy something else. What I guess you're technically buying something else, but what I like to do with my surface sowed seeds is to mix them with vermiculite, which is the shiny stuff in
Mhm.
potting soil, or just cover them and just be like, just surface sow them. So it's really hard to bury them too deep when they're in vermiculite. So that's been something that's been helpful to me, and just, passing that around to people and like that have had similar problems. Or just like surface sow them and then you sprinkle potting soil on top. Like
Yeah, instead of pushing them in or
you're
covering.
salting your
Yeah.
seeds with potting soil type
Mhm.
of motion.
And
Sometimes a visual.
just in case you're thinking that you have to go to some crazy specialty store to get this stuff, you can.
Mhm.
We do have actually on the CCD site a list of horticulture suppliers in the state of Kentucky. But I will say from experience, you can order perlite, vermiculite, peat, cocoa coir. Cocoa coir comes in this
It's like a
often in like
brick.
compressed
A
bricks, and
bale,
so
yeah.
Mhm.
so it ships a lot smaller. You can rehydrate it, and then if you want to get into mixing your own stuff, if you do it right, it can be much cheaper than buying the pre-mixed stuff.
If you need a lot, yeah.
If you need a lot of it, and that you can get that stuff all like you can get that all from the world's largest online retailer. They sell large, 4 cubic foot bags of perlite in different sizes. So yeah, you can if you don't know where a supplier is, sometimes I think sometimes we talk about some of this technical stuff and it feels like,
Mhm.
well, okay, but where do I even get that? You
Mhm.
can just order it. You can also order smaller bags of it,
Mhm.
like Scott's and Miracle Grow and all those. They have, and they might have it at the box store, just perlite, just to mix a
They
little bit.
they do now. Sometimes it's not with the potting soil though. Look by the houseplants stuff, like the
Mm,
houseplant fertilizer
Yeah.
and houseplant things, and they have some straight peat moss, straight perlite, straight vermiculite, because I bought it, in real small bags, and you're not filling. You might fill two
And that
trays,
goes a long way for homeowners. I mean, those small bags, and one of my old mixes is just a 50-50 peat moss and almost that same amount vermiculite. But I mean, whatever mix, whatever reason you're mixing to make your own, a little goes a long way for homeowners,
but for
especially if you're using seed trays. But
yeah,
commercials obviously a lot different. Yeah.
and there's
To
I
to just
would
briefly reprise my lame joke archetype, please, my dad is Mr. Moss. Call me Pete. Thank you.
Oh man. Oh, here it
Sorry,
comes. It's Friday. That's not a ticket to say these things, Brett. That's not a
sorry,
ticket to say these
sorry,
things.
but
sorry.
Oh
I think
man.
okay, so and we've talked about starting seeds before, so I don't want to like get too hung up on that, because we have an episode on starting seeds, which it's important this time of year. But I think that there's like the growing on part of it too,
Mhm.
and we've kind of talked
mm,
about a little bit about light. As far as fertilizer, they don't need a ton of fertilizer when they're that young.
No.
I tend often to not, depending on how long I'm
yeah.
keeping track of them. If it's like a tomato or a zinnia that's quick, like it germinates in 2 days and it's out the door in 6 weeks max. I may only hit it with fertilizer one time, and then
Mhm.
but I'm putting fertilizer down when I plant, so it's
Right.
ready to go. But they're usually pretty good because there's everything's so fast. You don't need to overdo it. If you've got like something that's a 12-week until it goes outside,
Hmm.
you might need to fertilize a little bit. But remember, a lot of the times when we're starting our seeds, it's still cool outside. They're not getting the right amount of light. So if you over fertilize, you're going to push them in a bad way, just like if the light's not where it needs to be. And then there's the getting it in the ground. Like I think that's part of the transplant section, is making sure that you're planting well. You're planting on, the ideal day is like a cloudy day so that they're not super stressed.
Especially if they've not been hardened off.
Yeah,
Right.
I've
I'm the
lost a lot of
worst.
a lot of
Yeah,
plants.
maybe let's talk about hardening off really quick, Ray. Like
Yeah.
you're
That sounds
Yeah.
like it's the third part of the temperature control, right? There's
yeah,
Yes,
temperature
and
really
control
light
for
is.
and light.
Environment
germinating
and temperature,
and
yeah.
temperature control for the growing on, and then the temperature control for hardening off.
Hmm.
Yeah, because you grow these things under your nice grow light or on interior conditions. They're not really, in most
Yeah.
cases,
Yeah.
ready to go outside under full sun because you're going to get a lot of marginal and just total leaf burn potentially. So, usually, what you're doing, I guess, for most plants, is you go through this period. The first thing I think about doing that week or so, or even up to 2 weeks before I move plants outside. If I did fertilize once, maximum twice, is no more fertilizer, and then I
Hmm.
start cutting the water slowly.
Hmm.
Uh, that's my first step. The second step is I move those plants ideally in and out on a cloudy day, get them used to some sun or evening sun, not direct sunlight. You need to go through a process of temperature and light acclimation. And that's
Hmm.
what we were calling hardening off. You just don't take a plant that's been grown on the inside under grow lights and put it in the sun because it will melt very
Hmm.
quickly. And so you need to go through that process and become familiar with that hardening off. So it involves, first of all, water towards the end of the process, and that'll help a little bit. And then you start kind of, as I said, moving that plant in and out slowly to get used to the sun.
And that's another reason not to start your transplants too early, because
Hmm.
if they're ready to go and you can't get them in the ground yet because it's, you got a frost coming or something like that, you're going to spend more time moving them in and out versus, having them ready. But yeah, 10 days, a week is kind of like a minimum that I would say for
Hmm.
most plants, depending
Yeah.
on how hard, how good your light is. But it's an acclimation process. That's what hardening off
Yes.
is. and
And
it's
definitely do that. Don't
really
just take that
important.
tender. Yeah.
Are
And
Take
I've
there
it
made the
from
mistake
us.
before. Yeah. Oh,
are there
yeah. I've killed plants
common
before.
are there common signs you look for that maybe you're pushing them too hard when you're hardening them off? Like as far as their
Burn.
responses, yeah.
Burn
Yeah.
is
Just
usually the
leaf
first.
burn.
They're like
Yeah.
sun scald on the
Yeah.
Mm,
leaves, some spotting or a withering when
mm,
they really shouldn't be.
Sometimes you just get collapse if you get a really warm spring day and and you just kind of throw them out on morning sun for 4 hours. You're going to get burn and wilt.
mm.
I
It's going to look
I
cooked.
I will say though, you don't want that to happen
Right.
because every time that a plant gets
Yes, that's
stressed,
what
it
we're
has set
saying,
back.
Brett. Yes, that's what we're
Mhm.
Well,
saying.
right. But
Only the strong will survive.
what I was going to
Live or
say,
die
actually,
gardening.
wilting's not. Yeah, you don't want that to happen. But if it does happen, don't just freak out and throw the flat out.
Yeah, yeah.
Water
No.
them, pull them into a shadier location, and you will be shocked. They look like
Hmm.
they are
As long as
dead,
the bud is not,
Right.
yeah, damaged. Yeah.
and they come back with. So to this point, and on the why you want to do this on a overcast day, we had some watermelon when I used to work at the farm. We had some watermelon transplants for a project, and it was just going to storm. I was trying to avoid cursing. It was going to storm very hard, and it was like that before the storm, weird May,
Hmm.
early June
Yeah.
timeline where it's just so hot.
Hmm.
And of
Right.
course they're going into black plastic. Of course the transplants aren't as far along as they
Extra
should
heat.
be. All those
Right.
All
things.
the
But I was like,
things.
look,
Yeah.
we got to try. We got to do this. So I put them in, and those things looked done. Absolutely done. I
Crisp.
was like,
What
this was
have
the
we
dumbest
done?
thing. Why did we do this? It rained, they chilled out, and like 95% of them popped right back up. And granted, they were stressed. They didn't do as well as they would have if
But they're
everything had
young,
worked out
though. They're
perfectly.
young.
But
Yeah.
I mean, it was one of those like moments where I was just like, they're done. I mean, they look like melted. It looks like you took this and it was made of ice cream and you
Scalding
put it
water.
into
Yeah.
and they came back and survived. And that from then on, I was like, okay, plants are pretty tough.
Plants want to live. They want to
Yeah.
live, but
So
also
again,
like.
you don't want this to happen, as my colleagues have amply demonstrated. But there is a lot of resilience in
Mhm.
plants as well. So
And,
we're at the hardening off phase and thinking about
yeah.
the transplant phase. Is that where we are?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Getting
think
them
I
in the
see.
ground.
I've had I've had a lot of experience with people planting transplants of all like they've been gardening their entire life and they've never planted a thing in their life. Had a lot of experience of all different sizes of plants. So I feel like pretty good about talking about things to do and things you might not think about if this is your first time or maybe you had some problems with plants the last year. For 90% of plants, the only one I can think of off the top of my head would be tomatoes. It is very important to plant at the right depth. You don't want to smother them. So you don't want to have a bunch of soil going up that stem because it will rot most of the time.
Mm.
And
Hello,
you also,
Rhizoctonium pythium.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And you also don't want roots sticking out of the ground. That is like my biggest pet peeve is when I see roots that have popped up. And I know sometimes like you think you tucked it in and I go back when I do planting and I, find a few that just decided not to settle down properly. But make sure the roots are covered. If they dry out, that plant is weak, it wilts early, things eat it, like, it gets knocked out. It's just a really simple thing that is, I think, one of the things I see done wrong the most is it's just not settled down into the ground. The second thing that people don't do is water in their transplants. It is,
Hmm.
I don't care if it's going to
Mhm.
rain in 2 hours because
Right.
the moment you don't water, it doesn't rain. And then it's the middle of the
Right.
night. You forget about it by the morning. I've been there. I understand. Water your transplants in because even just a little shot of water, it's not a super deep watering that you're doing. You're
An
just
air cavity is not your roots' friend. Air
exactly.
cavities
Mhm.
will destroy your roots
What you're
underground.
trying to do
Yeah.
is settle that soil around that root ball and you're tucking it in at night. Like you're getting all snuggly and tucking it
Mhm.
in, and that is make sure it's planted at the right depth and make sure you water it in are the two biggest things that will set you off for success, kind of after that hardening off phase that I could recommend.
And we're talking about planning here, Alexis, and maybe we should talk about a little bit of a fringe case here when we're dealing with transplants, and it comes up from time to time, but like squash and cucumbers, there's a little bit different strategy when you're growing those transplants because those transplants are so tender, the roots are so tender
Mm.
that you want to grow those typically, I think, for homeowners in like a peat container that can be planted directly into the ground. Because if you try to grow some of those crops, finding crops specifically, like squash, cucumbers, things like that, you have watermelon that kind of falls into that. There's a lot of crops that the roots are just so tender that if for whatever reason you're growing transplants of those crops at home, you'll want to put those in peat containers and transplant the whole container into the soil, because if you try to pull that transplant out of that container, 9 times out of 10, you've already killed that transplant. It's done. And I try to stress that to homeowners if I figure out that they're going to grow some of these things, to go ahead and use peat containers for those very tender crops. And if you have questions on that, we have the Home Vegetable Gardening in Kentucky has some wonderful charts. I think like Table 5 has some of that data. There's a lot of information on growing transplants in that Home Vegetable Gardening in Kentucky. I think, what is that, ID 128?
Mhm.
Yeah, ID
Uh,
128. Tables
Publication
5
number.
and 6 are good for
Yes,
transplanting.
but all of this information is in there. But for homeowners, pay close attention to that. If you're growing those crops, you'll want to use peat containers so that you don't have to slip those transplants out and put them in the soil. You can just direct plant those. And
Hmm.
since you were talking about planting in the soil, Alexis, I thought I'd kind of add that on,
Yeah,
that
I
it's a
didn't.
little
I had
bit
never
different
thought about
process.
that. Right. I grew some gourds for a class that I taught, and I had some left over in like a cell tray, and not a big cell tray, like I think it was like a 72 cell. So the cells are the size of a $50 or something like that.
Hmm.
And so I had one tray left over, and I put them down on some fabric at the house, and I was like, oh, I'll plant these, extras at the house and have some gourds. And I put them down and, kept them watered, and they were on like a weed mat type fabric that's like woven. So there's the roots could get down in there. And don't you know, those those things made it all season in those cell trays, and they
Nice.
rooted down through that weed mat,
Oh, wow.
and I had gourds, and they grew gourds, even though they were in that.
That's a little crazy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't fertilize them. I mean, they might have gotten a little bit because of other stuff I was hitting, but they got watered and they got tons of powdery mildew, and I did nothing. I was like, plants want to live, right? They'll figure
They
most of
do.
the time they figure out a way.
You'll see that
It's just
dandelion growing in the concrete, and you're like, "How does that work?" Or
yeah,
through asphalt. Yeah, Johnson grass through asphalt, where we just shoot straight up through 6 inches of asphalt. Yeah.
it's the
Yeah,
devil.
I mean, I would say on the if you have grown them. So I've only ever grown like those cucurbit transplants in like a actual legit greenhouse, and never that was it was simulating a
Mhm.
production commercial scale environment,
Mhm.
and we didn't have any issues. But yeah, I mean, that is a good shot. I just think if you were able to grow vigorous transplants and you've been doing it without the peat container thing, go for it.
That means you know how to handle those gently. You
Yeah.
probably already
Yeah,
have a
yeah.
good,
You have like
grasp on, no pun intended, good grasp on how to be gentle with
a
those.
Yeah,
right,
and
right.
I
But
think
yeah.
too that just it's nice to have some training wheels or some gutters
Mhm.
in the
Yeah,
bowling lane to just
that's
help
more for
you
newer
grow more.
growers because
Yeah,
they
well,
are a
I
bit more
really really
tender,
like
those
that.
crops. But now commercially, I never think about that because I know how to push that from the bottom, and they even make trays that are pushable. Like you can pop
Yeah.
trays that you can pop them out. Commercially, you just know to handle certain crops more
Mhm.
gently. But for homeowners that may be getting started, yeah, that's mostly advice for them to get those transplants started and keep them growing
One last
rapidly.
thing that I see people ask me. So when you're putting in transplants, we're talking about something pretty small, right? Like we're not talking about, I guess technically a large gallon size big shrub is a technically a transplant, but I think for the spirit of this episode, we're talking about something small, you may be able to hold two or three in your hand at one time kind of thing. Do not rip apart that root system, even if it's something that isn't super sensitive like a cucurbit crop. I think that in our minds, a lot of people have planted larger things like shrubs, and we were always taught. I remember my mom saying, you got to kind of rough up the root system because they're usually root bound and they've been in those nursery pots for 2 years. Transplants are not that way. Like little transplants have only been in there for the
But here's the
perfect amount
greed
of weeks.
portion. There's some
Don't.
greed in there.
Okay, but wait, no, wait, Rank, you're gonna confuse people. Let me get through this.
I am going to confuse people. I'm going to confuse them.
For 99% of everything you're gonna grow, do not disrupt that root system. Put it right in the
Hmm.
ground the way it is. If it's small. Now, what Ray is
Yeah.
about to tell you is something like if you accidentally get 2 tomato seeds in the same
Or
same
six
tray, or six
basil
basil.
in one little cell. What do you do in that? And that's a good point, Alexis. What would you do in that situation? Let's say you had 3 basil plants which is pretty typical. Pick on basil
Mm-hmm.
that'll come up in
Mm-hmm.
one cell pack or one
Mm-hmm.
cell. Um, what would you do there? Would you snip? Because that's an option. You can snip
Mm-hmm.
two and just leave one growing. Or if you want to roll the dice, I guess you could try, but that's always a risk of breaking the plant.
Yeah, so I like to
What would
when
you
I
do? I
was in
mean,
school,
sometimes I
I did
snip
a
and
lot of
some, yeah.
quote unquote brain surgery in the way of transplanting very tiny
Mm,
tiny plants.
yeah.
And so yeah, I the way I seed, and I'm growing like kind of larger quantities of
Hmm.
things. You'll ultimately always have like a couple cells that don't come up. Either they missed the seed
Yeah.
and it got into the other cell, or you just had a dud, or something got ate, whatever. You always have a couple cells. So I usually leave, if I've got 5 cells that have a couple in each, I'll leave them until I know, and I'll plug those in, and I'll do some brain surgery. I'll get out like my tiny little tool, and I will pot them up when they're very small, because when plants are
Hmm.
really small, they rebound actually really quickly. So even if you break off, there's only half an inch of root there. Even if you break off a little bit of it, it'll still rebound. So they actually
Yeah.
rebound better when they're tiny than when they're big.
Hmm.
And so I'll do that. Or if you have enough plants, if you got as much as you need, just snip them off. Just make your life easy. You
I
could.
was thinking more when you're buying, like I go to a greenhouse and let's say there's something that I want that I didn't grow transplants. I'm kind of greedy and I look for those cell trays of basil that have bonus basil in them so I can do
Okay.
brain surgery on those. That's
So
only for when I'm purchasing
if
things. I'm
it's
like, ooh, that one
yeah,
tray has 3
yeah.
tomatoes per
If
cell.
it's larger and you're buying it and you don't have the luxury of getting it when it's small,
Yeah.
there are some plants that will be fine being ripped apart.
Sometimes you may kill plants. Yeah,
Yeah.
as Alexis is saying, you're just kind of rolling the dice. Even though Dad is thrifty over here, I'm pretty thrifty if I'm purchasing plants because I don't know about you guys, but plants have gotten expensive. Transplants when you go to purchase them at local retail outlets. I mean, for good reason because it takes a lot of resources and media and stuff that has gotten more expensive. I understand all of that, but when tomatoes are like $5 a plant at a
Hmm.
local box store, and I see that one of those round packs that you get from a
Mhm.
local farm, supplier has like 3 tomatoes in there. I'm going to do some brain surgery on those. I'm going to be separating those.
I
But if I'm
say,
growing them myself, I generally
yeah,
don't. I'll snip them,
if
yeah,
you're
or
willing
whatever.
to lose some, and
Yeah,
then, definitely by all means. I'm also
rolling the
thrifty, but
dice.
90% of the time, do not mess up that root system.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and just like we said, we talked about with some of the vine crops and stuff being very sensitive. All the young roots are very sensitive in general, so the less disturbance you can have on those, the better. I find so you don't set those back. But we're talking about all these variables that we're controlling and maybe possibly purchasing some equipment to grow a good sturdy transplant at home. Why do people do this? I mean, why do you guys grow transplant? I mean, what's your motivation? Maybe we can wrap up with that. What is it? And I always love to hear from people why they're going to the trouble of growing transplants when you can go and purchase a few if you just have a small home garden.
I mean, aside from saving some money.
Some money. Yeah, because that grow light's obviously going to last more than one season. And if you're growing a quantity, you can definitely save money very quickly if you need a pretty good quantity of plants. But
I
one
would
of the
I would
reasons it got me
say,
into yeah, go ahead,
yeah.
Brett. Sorry.
Well, no, you should keep going.
No, no,
One
I
of
was
the
just going
reasons.
to say that there's just certain things that maybe that you can't buy. But yeah,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
that's
your
definitely for
selection
me.
expands.
Yeah, I
Is that
can't
what it
go and pick
is?
up the varieties that I want from the store, and I don't want the standard, hybrid Better Boy or whatever the new hybrid is that is
Mhm.
everywhere. Mountain Fresh or something. No shade to those. Go for it if you like those. I actually don't. For me personally, it's been really interesting. I've gotten into mostly starting like native perennials and woody plants and things. And they involve, many of those involve like this process of getting them, soaking them in water and or keeping them cold for a long period of time ahead of time, scarification, stratification, those types of things. But the process of starting them is very, very similar to everything we've talked about here. And in that case, it is I can't find the types of things that I want locally,
Mhm.
or B, like it just is really, they're really expensive to have to buy if you want a bunch to do kind of like a, if I wanted to get like 40 milkweed plants, I can buy a thing of seed and some stuff for $10 total, maybe materials. Whereas 40 of those, I mean, you're talking hundreds of dollars probably. So that, I mean,
Mhm.
those are the
Mhm.
big reasons for me. But I think also there is something really beautiful and poetic about the seed starting time of year, and how it's like we're in the middle
Mhm.
of this
Yeah.
cold. It represents this like
Yeah.
promise. The seed has everything
Kind of
that
the
it
hope
needs
for the
inside of
future.
there. Like there really is of something really beautiful about that cycle. And not only that, but that the seed is not the beginning, it's the product of all the things that happened in the plant last year that created that seed. And like this, I don't know, there is something really special about that. And I think it does, there is this shared experience of the mania cabin fever of cold weather that is so human. And like, look, we have heat. Imagine if you didn't have heat and it was just sort of like keeping a fire going. Imagine how excited you'd be for spring. And I'm
Mhm.
pretty excited as
Hmm.
it is. So
Oh
those
yeah.
that I do it for that reason too, because it is kind of insane. In some ways, it's kind of insane to have all this stuff set up and do this, and the water and all these things. But we're crazy about plants.
And you have a cool, and I find that I like the glow in my office where I
Yeah.
have like a little grow lab, 6 foot wide grow lab, 4 tier kind of thing, and it produces this glow. And I don't know why I like that so much at night. My office is the bright office; it still has the lights going because I'm trying to run them 12, 13, 14 hours. So yeah, but it's something cool having something growing at that time of year. In mid March, you've got you've seeded things in some cases, and you have little growing things at a time of year where the long winter is still going on. So I enjoy that too, Brett. I do like
And
having growing things
it
around.
represents that you're still making plans. And as long as you're still making plans, it means you still have hope. And I'm not trying to get down too far of an emotional track here, but like that's what it represents to me, is that I'm still thinking about, okay, in a month or two or 3 or whatever, I'm still going to be here doing these things. And there's something really, in a time where it can be really, really easy to get down about all the things that are happening, it does represent. And I think that's why it's so important to like so many refugee communities and just migrant communities in general that do all this gardening and do all this stuff. You see this common thread of them, a lot of them doing gardening and growing stuff. And if they have a porch window, they're going to put some seeds in
Mhm.
some stuff in a porch window and grow it. And it just represents that kind of restarting, hope, rebirth cycle kind of thing, I think. Anyway.
Hmm.
Yeah. I love growing things. I mean, and you're growing things at a time of year where, normally you may not be if you're a homeowner. So it's good stuff. It seems
Aw.
like in the future we need to do an extension of this. It made me think of that, Brad.
Propagation.
Well, propagate and seed saving. I mean, seed
Yeah.
saving is its
Yeah.
own huge topic, and it goes
Mm.
along very well with this. A little bit different time of year, maybe, but maybe midsummer, early summer, when
Hmm.
you can start to identify. But I love the seed saving stuff because I come from an area of long seed savers, and some seeds you can
Hmm.
save, and some you probably shouldn't try to save. But that's a huge topic. I mean, you get into all kinds of subtopics when you talk about seed saving,
Hmm.
but
Mm.
Totally.
we used to end the season by saving some of the heirloom like tomato varieties that uh,
Hmm.
we would select, and reach certain maturity level. But yeah, it seems to go along with this. But some of your comments made me think about that, Brett. It kind of bookends the other end of the season for me is the seed saving on
Yeah.
the other end. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So we talked about light, temperature, media, a little bit of the techniques, making sure that after you have stuff seeded, or sorry, you start off, you got a plan. I want a 6-week-old transplant and I want to transplant it on date X, work back 6 weeks, and that's your seeding date. You go through all the steps using the different media stuff we talked about. You get that plant ready to go. Before you're ready to plant it out, about a week to 10 days before you're ready to plant it out, you put it
Mhm.
outside, let it harden off, adjust gradually to sunlight and temperature and all that kind of stuff, and then put it in the ground, ideally disturbing the roots as little as possible, making sure that you plant it to the correct depth, which is usually to the top of the soil ball, with the top of the soil ball covered with
Mhm.
soil. Water it in well at the time of planting, and
Mm-hmm.
then grow it in the ground. Have fun. Enjoy the thing.
Watch it shoot
Transplanting is a
up so fast.
Yeah.
watch
Mm-hmm.
it have a 10-week head start on all the weeds, which is one of those reasons we do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it really is a key part of a lot of production systems and ways of growing stuff. But it's also a good way to get connected with plants is earlier in the season than you'll be able to get outside and mess with them. So that sound like a decent recap?
I
I
think
love it.
so.
Yeah.
All
I think it's
right.
pretty good.
Well, Alexis, you want to take us home?
Yes, of course. Well, we thank you for being here with us today and listening to us like be super excited about transplants. We hope you're super excited about growing some seeds for yourself, even if it's just something fun and get you through the winter, because that's for me. I totally agree. But you can leave us a review if you like hearing about transplants. If you want to hear about all kinds of different propagation and listen to Brett and I just get like super jacked about stratification of seeds, we can do that. Just tell us in the review. You guys rock. Let's hear about that. Let us know. It's super helpful. You can also shoot us an email with any ideas that you may have or questions that you may have. If you're like, I don't know what stratification is, please tell me more, but just in an email, because yeah, you can do that at hortculturepodcast@l.uky.edu. You can also shoot us a direct message, a DM, if you will, on Instagram, Hort Culture Podcast. If you'd like to see any videos of that brain surgery that we talked about, I actually think I have one on my phone. Maybe I'll post that about the snapdragons that I went a little crazy with. So we can do that, cuttings, those kinds of things. So if you want to see more on that, please definitely let us know what you're into, because we just talk about what we like and hopefully that's what you like. But we hope that as we grow this podcast, you will continue to grow with us and that you will join us next time. Have a great one, y'all.